as I had the opportunity and good luck to photograph them with my Bell Howell, which just came on the market. We are on the transatlantic steamer Paris, bound for England. Unexpectedly, I met my friend Bert Lewin on deck. He had returned about 3 years before from his analysis in Berlin. He also was going to the Congress, so we had a lively discussions and a very jolly time on our crossing. This is me in a younger edition. We soon arrived in England, where we were driven by the Windsor Castle and saw the changing of the guards on our way to Oxford. Now we are in Oxford. It rained the first day of the meeting, a common occurrence in England. Here is the Congress Hall where our meeting will be held. The tall colleague is Dr. Reed from Cincinnati. Next, Dr. Clarence Obendorf from New York. One of the first arrival is Dr. Stephen Hollosh from Budapest. And here is Dr. Clarence Obendorf and Dr. Fritz Wittels from Vienna, who had by 1929 settled in New York. Here I am directing them to be less serious. Here is Dr. Smith Eli Jellef from New York and Dr. Max Eitingon from Berlin. Dr. Raymond de Saussure from Paris. This is Dr. Edward Glover from London. The old gentleman is Dr. Eder, England's first analyst. This is Dr. Rottenberg from Brooklyn. You see Dr. Sándor Ferenczi from Budapest, my own analyst, holding his umbrella open. Here comes Princess Maria Bonaparte, Princess of Greece, one of the vice presidents of the Congress. She is followed by Dr. Paul Federn. The next pictures were taken at the lunch recess in the garden of the Congress Hall. You see Dr. A.A. Brill, Dr. Smith Eli Jellef to the left with the straw hat, Dr. Clarence Obendorf, Dr. Otto Fennikel, Melanie Klein, and Dr. Karen Horney. Behind the lady, unknown, with his hand in his pocket, is Dr. Saracen. To her left is Dr. Sweeney. This is Dr. Karen Horney and Mrs. Alexander. On the left of the screen, you see Dr. Franz Alexander. And now we have Dr. Franz Alexander with Dr. Gregory Zilberg. Here you see Dr. Lillian Powers, Dr. Hollosh with Paul Federn is behind Dr. Powers. The white-haired lady with her back to the camera is Dr. Herford. Here is a close-up of Dr. Federn and Dr. Herford. On the screen left is Dr. Edward Hitchman from Vienna. The lady in the polka dot dress is Sybil Yates. Behind her is Adrian Stevens from England. The man with the beard is James Strachey, Freud's editor. In front of him is Adrian Stevens. The bearded gentleman is Dr. Jekyll from Vienna, who later settled in New York. Behind the lady in the dark coat is Dr. and Mrs. Pfeiffer from Budapest. You see next Mrs. Lewis. And here is a better shot of Dr. and Mrs. Pfeiffer. He was later killed by the Nazis. On the right is Dr. Rudolf Löwenstein from Paris and Dr. Hans Sachs from Berlin. The tall colleague is Dr. George Daniels from New York. You all know him. He's from the Columbia Group. Dr. Johann van Ophuysen is on the extreme right. In the dark suit is Dr. Johann van Ophuysen and Dr. Edward Glover with a pipe. Dr. van Ophuysen was the secretary of the International Psychoanalytic Association at this time. Next we see Dr. Hermann Nürnberg from Vienna and Marjorie Franklin. Barbara Lowe is behind Dr. Nürnberg. Here is a better shot of Dr. Nürnberg, and Barbara Lowe is talking with Marjorie Franklin behind her. Next you see Melanie Klein with Dr. Karen Horney, both from Berlin, and Dr. Derry from Los Angeles. Here is Dr. and Mrs. Jackals from Vienna. Dr. Ernst Simmel is turning around. Dr. and Mrs. Nunberg, and then I come into the picture with my usual cigar. Here you see Dr. and Mrs. Nunberg again, lighting up. They were newlyweds and on their honeymoon. The group sat down for an official photograph after lunch, and you will see some new faces. In the center are Dr. Karen Horney, Dr. Max Eitingon from Berlin. Max Eitingon was elected president of the International Psychoanalytic Association at this meeting. Dr. and Mrs. Correa are there. He was the first analyst in Boston, and in the middle you see Dr. Hans Sachs. Here are Dr. and Mrs. Stern from New York, and Dr. and Mrs. Correa behind them. Here you see Dr. Sweeney and his wife, Dr. Lillian Powers. This is Dr. Lieberman from Berlin with a camera. You see here Marianne Chris and Sybil Yates, who is the blonde lady on the right, and Eddie Jacobson. Dr. Jacobson is a little one smiling on the center right. You see here Dr. A. Brill with a cane. Next, you see Dr. Sandor Ferenczi. From left to right, Mrs. Rado, Dr. Rado, Gregory Zilborg, A. Brill, Franz Alexander, and Dr. Hollosh. I am on the left with Dr. Richmond. You see Dr. and Mrs. Feigenbaum from New York. Dr. Feigenbaum is in the dark suit. He was the founder of the Psychoanalytic Quarterly. Next we see Dr. and Mrs. Pfeiffer and Dr. Dimanche. Here you see Dr. Jackals with Helena Deutsch and Mrs. Rado. Dr. Sweeney is next with the dark suit and the white hat. In this group you see Mrs. Rado in the white dress with Dr. Jackals, Helena Deutsch, Mrs. Feigenbaum, and Lillian Powers. In the middle you see Anna Freud in the black beret. Mrs. Derry from Los Angeles. Dr. Obendorf is in the center. Anna Freud and Dr. Sachs are on his left. Dr. Smith, Eli Jelliff, is in the straw hat. Here is Mrs. Rado, Dr. Rado, Helena Deutsch, and me. Next, Drs. Rado, Eitingon, Zilberg, and Anna Freud. Dr. Johann von Ophuijsen, in the dark suit, speaks with Anna Freud. There you see Gregory Zilberg and Max Eitingon. There is Dr. Hollosh with his hands in his pocket, and Dr. Sachs and Dr. Ferenczi. Dr. Otto Fennikel stands on the right with his hand in his pocket. Dr. Jacobson is there, and nearby is Dr. Sweeney and Dr. Karen Horney. The man in the gray suit is Dr. Stern from New York. Next you see Dr. Paul Federn and Dr. Karen Horney. Here we see Mrs. Rado, Dr. Jackals. You see the two women, Edith Jacobson and Susan Derry from Los Angeles. Dr. von Ophuijsen is on the left. A single good picture of Mrs. Derry from Los Angeles. Dr. Hollosh is on the left. He was a close associate of Dr. Sandor Ferenczi. Dr. Hans Sachs is in the center here. Dr. Clarence Obendorf smiles for the camera, Behind him stands Dr. Stern. The three together are Dr. Stern, Rado, and Sweeney, and then Dr. Hollows and Mrs. Feigenbaum. Dr. Feigenbaum is to the left, and Dr. Hollows looks directly into the camera. The bald-headed man with the mustache is Dr. Max Eitingon, the president of the International this year, and Dr. Daly from India is behind him. You see, first time Dr. Smells from Cincinnati is in his dark suit, and Dr. Hollows is on his right, and Dr. Van of Huysen on his left. In the foreground is Dr. Bohn and his wife from Berlin. Behind Mrs. Bohn is Melita Schmiedeberg, Melanie Klein's daughter. Dr. E. Brill is to the left. Melita Schmiedeberg is in the center. Dr. Demonche from Paris is on the left, and behind her is Dr. Daly. Dr. Otto Feinickel stands on the right. Here you see Dr. Daly again. Behind him are Dr. Brill and Dr. Ferenczi. The tall colleague in the front is Dr. Sobel, and Dr. Sweeney is to his right. Some members of the Congress went on an excursion to Salisbury and Stonehenge later, where we visited the cathedral and the Roman fortifications. On the main street of Salisbury, we see Dr. and Mrs. Nürnberg acting up for the camera. Dr. Feinickel is in the center. Here again we see Dr. Clarence Umdorf. And here is a nice shot of Melita Schmiedeberg. And Dr. Reed of Cincinnati. Dr. and Mrs. Nürnberg again, and behind them Dr. Demonche. Next to him, Dr. Löwenstein. We all had lunch in one of those lovely little inns that are found all over England. After lunch we visited the cathedral and strolled in the cathedral gardens. Here you see Bert Lewin and Mrs. Rado strolling. Do you see also the last shot of me? I want to appear again. Here is our group at the Salisbury Plain, where we sat and listened to Dr. Ernest Jones, who told us the history of the Roman occupation. This is the end of my film about the Congress. But before ending, I thought it might be interesting to show a few photographs taken by Dr. Freud in his family circle. I did not take that photographs of Freud because nobody could see him that summer after the Congress because he was not well. I told Ferenczi, whom I was supposed to accompany to Vienna and to see Freud, that I'm so disappointed that I didn't see him and I couldn't visit him. And I also wanted to include him in the picture. He wasn't at the Congress. He was the only one, the most important, whom I would like to have connected with that important Congress where you saw really all the early pioneers from the beginning, you know, those who stuck and were loyal to Freud and carried on the development of psychoanalysis. So Ferenczi surprised me in Budapest before I returned to America after the Congress, and he gave that to me as a present. I don't know how or where he got that film of Freud. I didn't ask, but before I left Budapest that summer, end of August 1929, coming back to America, he presented me with that film, which we are seeing now, of Freud in his family environment.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.